it's been a week, hasn't it? It's been a week, and it's been a week where we just have said the names Thabo Bester, Dr. Nandipha Magudumana. South Africans have been mesmerized by the story of these two fugitives. Of course, that is Thabo Bester and Nandipha Magudumana and their affair.
Yeah, some have been calling it a affair, some have been calling it a tragic love story. Some saying no, it is absolutely not. It's a case of two criminals that have just partnered a criminal activity. So let's discuss this now with Chad Thomas from IRS Forensic Investigations, who joins us now via Zoom. And Chad, thank you so much for your time. Good morning to you. I mean, in your opinion, is this more of just a tragic love story gone wrong, or pure criminality, and nothing more than just criminal partnerships between Thabo Bester and Dr. Nandipha?
You know, the Afrikaners are very descriptive. They speak about soort soek soort. In English, we say birds of a feather. In an instance like this, there's no tragic love story. This isn't star-crossed lovers. It's not Romeo and Juliet, or in their case, what they'd love to have been, Bonnie and Clyde. This is a case of two people that were clearly deviants, that managed to find one another and have abused the system for as much as they possibly could have, and for as long as they could have. And if it wasn't for groundbreaking media reports, especially by Ground Up, for all intents and purposes, they'd still be living the high life in 5, 6, 7-star luxury out of a mansion in Hyde Park.
But now, see, in this particular situation where we find these two who, you know, have been dubbed the Bonnie and Clyde by those who have seemingly been mesmerized, as we mentioned in our intro, by the story, had it not been for the Tanzanian authorities, we may actually not have had them come back to the country. You know, I mean, this has now been the work of a different country, a different country's laws, a different country's regulations, and a different country's strictness that has seen these two coming back home to be prosecuted and tried right here. So Ground Up did amazing work. We can never even doubt that. But the authorities in a different country, that's where it really just changed, essentially, the game for these two.
Of course, if it wasn't for the fact that the South Africans had circulated them and it had become such a public story, they wouldn't have gone on the run, wouldn't have started making mistakes, and wouldn't have eventually been picked up in a foreign country and then deported back to South Africa. So kudos to the Tanzanian government, but of course it was because of the insistence of the South African government in the light of the massive media that took place in respect to the reporting of this particular matter. But one must understand that you've picked on an exceptionally important point here, is the fact that if they hadn't been exposed, if the Tanzanian government hadn't been in a position to make arrests for them being in the country illegally, where would we be standing now? And what this has done is it's shone a floodlight on the massive problems within the South African criminal justice system. It's difficult enough for the layman and the public to navigate what has become a very complex criminal justice system in South Africa. But more importantly, we're seeing that due to capacity and resource issues, we're becoming a country with a criminal justice system that isn't working to protect its citizens. And we can't any longer go forward and rely on the fact that it's capacity, it's resource, and it's all these other factors that have come into play. We've had such a long time to prepare for a growth in population, to prepare our systems in our country to support that growth in population, and we've been let down, whether it comes to electricity, whether it comes to water, and most importantly, when it comes to the right of life and the right of the safety of the citizens. And this spotlight has now been able to expose the debilitating state of our law enforcement in South Africa.
Chad, just staying with Tanzania for a moment, I mean, one would think that, or at least assume, that because they used fake passports to enter into Tanzania, it's been recorded that they had numerous, fake identities on their route to wherever they were heading to, obviously running away from law enforcement authorities here in South Africa. One would think that the Tanzanian law enforcement would want to, have their time with them to at least, charge them in Tanzania for that crime, because they were in Tanzania illegally. Why do you think that we didn't see that? We didn't see them head to court in Tanzania. We didn't see them stand trial, facing charges there of, being in numerous possessions of different passports and fake names. Why do you think that part of the story was hastened and perhaps, fast-tracked to them being in South Africa to face the other charges that they obviously were running away from in the country?
If you look at the South African context, we have a massive problem with undocumented foreigners. When we arrest undocumented foreigners in South Africa, they don't stand trial to be extradited. They generally don't stand trial because they've been in the country illegally. They get held in a place of safety like Lendela, outside of Rudolph, and then when there's sufficient numbers, they then get bussed or transported by train back to their countries of origin. Something very similar has happened in Tanzania. You've got people that were in the country illegally, and they could deport them. It wasn't a case of somebody legally in the country that has rights. It's not somebody who had a visa to be there in their correct name, that they could then fight to come back and say, look, this is a political motivated issue that they want to take me back to South Africa, or I've crossed the wrong people. It's not a situation like we saw with Roger Stratton in Australia, who wouldn't come back for the Brett Kebble murder, and they had to have an extradition process, which they failed. Right. It's not like Shwendwani, where they had to prove that there was a case against him in South Africa. They had broken Tanzanian rules, and the Tanzanians could have, if they wanted to, hold a trial and examine how they'd come into the country legally, or they could have taken the easy route, pleased their Southern African counterparts and deported them, which was fully within their rights. And that's what they've done. And it's expedited our entire process. And it's a win which was desperately needed by our South African law enforcement.
Chad, I mean, we can't think like criminals, so we wouldn't exactly know motive in this particular case. But if we could try and figure out maybe how, and I say how in the sense that, was it that easy for them to do what they've done? We track back to 2017, where Dr. Nandipha Magudumana got into, we'll call it a partnership, with Thabo Bester. How were they able to just pull this off? To essentially fool South Africa, where it required ground up and one or two pictures in a Woolworths store for this to blow up the way it really did. Was it really that easy for them?
I think that's the shocking reality that everybody's waking up to, is how were they able to do this with such ease? And the reality, we talk about, if you don't like somebody, you pay an inkabi to take them out. If there's a particular car that you want but you can't afford it, you buy it on the illicit market, you buy a stolen car. If there's something that you really want, you don't work towards it anymore, you feel entitled to get it. And we see that if you have access to funds, or if you make a way of getting access to funds through illicit means, you become more entitled, you become more emboldened. And this is the shock for South Africans. South Africans are still trying to reconcile with the fact that one of the biggest maximum security prisons in the world has allowed something like this to happen. They're trying to wake up to the reality that we get told on a daily basis that our state-owned entities should be privatized because things get done better in the private sector, yet here a private prison has allowed a dangerous criminal to escape. And not just that, while he was still incarcerated, he had the run of the show. He could basically say he was anywhere in the world. He could be involved in webinars. He could be bringing in investors into their illicit schemes. It just begs belief how this was able to develop over these years, and not much was said about it. And it brings us back to this strange dynamic we're finding in South Africa, is that we're seeing that money can buy absolutely anything. We've lost sense of our moral compass. It's all about having the best car, having the nicest house, and going about it in the easiest possible manner. And when you see the levels of corruption that must have gone into such a brazen escape, but not just the escape, what led up to the escape, the fact that they were running a business generating tens of millions of rands. Again, I say to you, we as South Africans, and myself, somebody who's been involved in law enforcement for over 30 years, it still shocks me, and I shouldn't get shocked anymore.
Yeah.
And it's making us a very jaded society.
Absolutely, and I was just saying to my colleague off air that, you know, this prison break style saga involving Thabo Bester and Dr. Nandipha Magudumana has really almost, entrenched itself in both our personal and professional lives. There is absolutely no corridor you would not walk past, and this is not a conversation or at least a debate. But yes, we do know that Dr. Nandipha Magudumana and Thabo Bester are central figures here, Chad. But with your experience in law enforcement, obviously you know they couldn't have done this alone. Who are the other key role players here that have made this escape not only a success, but also been complicit here to crime that we need to also place our focus to? The justice system needs to interrogate and investigate. I mean, we're seeing what's unraveling in Parliament in as far as what the police was meant to do, what G4S, their role in still insisting that the remains in the cell after that fire broke out was Thabo Bester, even when DNA autopsy proved otherwise. I mean, they still insisted. But there are other figures here that definitely assisted this duo to make sure that this escape is, of course, a success. Who are they, in your opinion, that we have to definitely place special focus on?
At the outset of this breaking news, when we first established that Thabo Bester had in fact escaped and people were still in disbelief, I was interviewed on this very channel and I said it was gross incompetence, negligence and corruption of the highest order. I said it could not have taken place without millions of rands being involved and a lot of people being involved. I also stated categorically that the amount of people involved is going to grow exponentially day by day based on where this took place. You can't have a crime like this take place without multiple role players. And you can't have a crime like this take place without there being vast sums of money involved. This was an organized crime, make no mistake. This wasn't just a brazen escape. This wasn't just two people escaping into the night. This was an organized crime. And it shows how organized crime in South Africa has happened. Why do I say it's an organized crime? Well, you needed to pay people to be able to get bodies. You needed to pay people that had contacts within the prison system. You needed to get vehicles. You needed to get safe houses. You needed to have people paid off for their silence. So this was done on such a scale that it involved dozens of people. It didn't involve 1, 2, 3, or 4 people. It involved dozens of people. And so many people along that chain could have somewhere along the line blown the whistle and said something. But it just shows how money in South Africa can buy you anything.
Yeah, it certainly can, seemingly. But, you know, I think a lot of South Africans will breathe somewhat of a sigh of relief that finally there is some kind of, resolution to this organized crime that we've come to know about that has clearly been happening for several years. But Chad, we'll leave it there with you. Thank you so much for joining us here on the South African Morning. That is IRS Forensic Investigations Chief Executive Officer Chad Thomas. Now,